So welcome everybody to today's Starr Forum. My name is Kristin Fabbe, and I appreciate the great turnout today on a rainy Friday afternoon. It's with great pleasure that I introduce my longtime friend and colleague, Iason Athanasiadis. Tried to say that 3 times fast. You were lucky to have Iason with us here today, as I can't think of another writer who is better poised to provide insights on the events that have unfolded not just in Egypt, but in the wider region. Iason is fluent in Arabic and in Farsi, and he's a journalist and photographer who has lived in the region on and off for a decade. Dividing his time between Egypt, Turkey, Afghanistan, and Iran, where he was imprisoned for espionage charges in 2009 during the post-election unrest, Iason stands out as one of the few remaining journalists committed to delivering an accurate picture of how political and social unrest is experienced by the everyday man and woman on the street. His pictures speak 1,000 words, and his words speak for thousands. Iason studied Arabic and Modern Middle Eastern Studies at Oxford. In 2008, he was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard. Iason, thank you for coming. We look forward to hearing about your experience in Egypt, and we look forward to the questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming, and my apologies for being late. I just flew in from Chicago, and it's kind of terrible weather both here and there. I've been living in Istanbul since I did my Nieman Fellowship here in Cambridge. I've been living in Istanbul because it's just a great city from which to cover the region. It's a great city full stop, and then it's a great city from which to cover the region. I was living in Iran for 3 years until 2007, and since moving to Istanbul, I've been to the region again. I was in Iran again for the elections in 2009 when I ended up getting arrested. And since the crisis blew up in Greece, it's also been a very convenient jumping off point for covering my own country. But unfortunately, I wasn't in Istanbul when Egypt decided to have a revolution. I was in San Antonio having margaritas, bizarrely, and very frustratingly. And so as I followed the events on that from the 25th over the Wednesday and the Thursday, with the rumors that Gamal Mubarak and his other members of the Mubarak family had fled to the UK, as that Yom al-Ghadab, the day of rage, dawned on Friday, I was very much on the side of the Mubarakists. I'm embarrassed to admit I was hoping that this thing would sort of go away and I wouldn't have to go back to the region. But of course it didn't, and that tragic day of Friday led to 100 people at least being killed. It became very obvious that this was not a couple of demonstrations that were going to go away. This was going to be something that would crucially dominate the news agenda into the coming week. And it's, for the media professionals here, you understand the importance of a story dominating the news agenda into a second week. It suddenly acquires a narrative. It acquires a kind of extraordinary force that propels it forward, and it most crucially enters the consciousness of the viewing public. And so that Friday let me know that it was important that I be there. I booked myself a ticket from Boston, and I was in Cairo within 48 hours. European companies were cancelling their flights left, right, and center, but I flew back to Istanbul, and from there on Turkish Airlines, I managed to enter Egypt. I'm going to make a couple of points. First of all, I want to just flick through a couple of quick pictures. The key part of the presentation is that Wednesday night, Thursday morning, after the speech that Mubarak gave on the Tuesday night, Tuesday midnight, in which he basically conceded that he wasn't going to run for elections again. And that was very crucial because he was giving the demonstrators a lot of what they'd been demanding. He was effectively removing himself from the picture, if not immediately, then at some point in the near future. But after that carrot, he came out brandishing the stick of his loyalists, who attacked the square on the Wednesday night. So this is the site in Cairo airport when I arrived. There were thousands of people trying to leave the country. An estimated 500,000 left during those weeks, possibly more. There was very little sanitation. The water had run out, little food, and things were still very panicky. Driving into the city, we saw tanks at major intersections. Of course, we'd seen them already on Al Jazeera, clustering on the Corniche, on the Qasr al-Nil Bridge, and in all the entrances to Tahrir Square. But it was quite an extraordinary sight to also see them in residential neighborhoods, and also a little bit annoying for many Egyptians, because after that Yom al-Ghadab, that Friday, the police had melted away, and at the same time 6,000 to 7,000 criminals had been released from jails. That Mubarak scenario of after me the chaos comes, and a lot of looting had followed. So impromptu street militias had been set up, popular committees to guard streets, but the tanks and the soldiers themselves did very little to stop the looting, as Egyptians were telling us. Which takes us to the first visit to Tahrir Square. That of course, the Egyptians are famous for their sense of humor, and I think we saw that with lashings of that in the square itself. Some of the most inventive and funny slogans, both in Arabic and in English. This one says, "Irhal ba'a, idi wajati," go for God's sake, my hands are hurting, holding this up. and you've got a Coptic lady there with a great big cross in your face, right in the center. Very hard to say to what extent the Copts were participating. There were competing narratives. Pope Shenouda himself seemed to have taken a cautiously pro-Mubarak stance, and many of the Coptic community themselves were a little bit shaded by the experience of the Christians in Iraq after a similarly secular tyrant was unseated. And so it's hard to say, but I'd say that a significant part of the Coptic community were pro-stability. And that was something that became important later on. This man here holding up his paycheck, which comes to a little bit over $250 a month. He's a civil servant saying it's not possible for me to survive, to subsist on this kind of income. And more demonstrators. These were still the days when the people who were in the square were considered very much to be radicals beyond the pale of Egyptian society. The state media was relentlessly accusing them of being everything from pervert Egyptians to American pawns to Iranians, because Egypt and Iran haven't had diplomatic relations since the Islamic Revolution, or in fact since the Iranians named a street in Tehran after Khalid Islambouli, the killer of Sadat. Mubarak has been one of the main Arab autocrats who's accused Iran of being meddling in his country. This woman holding up a photograph of her son, who was killed in that day of rage, the Friday. And again, for those of you who've been to Cairo, of course, you'll know what a stunningly beautiful city it is. It's got these gorgeous Belle Epoque buildings. It was actually designed by the town planner Haussmann, who did also the Grand Boulevards of Paris. And you can see that a little bit in places like Medoun, Saha Talat Harb, the Talat Harb Square, close to Tahrir itself. But most of all, for a photographer, it was just a beautiful backdrop. I mean, imagine a revolution unfolding against Belle Epoque buildings and the Nile. And I think that some of the most memorable, resonant pictures that we'll take away from that revolution were the street battles that were fought on the bridges spanning the Nile, sort of tear gas floating across the Nile and into Zamalek. And of course, there's Grandpa with his canary green Vespa, yellow Vespa, and the M1A1 Abrams tank. This is Ramses Avenue in central Cairo, just next to the Syndicate of Journalists. That was actually, I think, the Monday before the Million-Man March of the Tuesday, which seemed to have forced Mubarak's hand to lead to that concession speech. And on the Monday things, there were a lot of pro-Mubarak loyalists out in the street. They weren't the thugs that we saw later. They weren't angry. They weren't belligerent. They were upset, and they were having healthy debates with the anti-Mubarak people. I hesitate to call them pro-democracy, though, of course, you had everything represented in that group. But instead of, in place of sort of one big label, I wouldn't say pro-democracy for the whole movement. Sorry. I've chosen this picture because obviously photographically it's not great, but in terms of the message that it puts across, this was something that I felt didn't really get reflected very much in the international coverage of the revolution or the revolt or the uprising. I felt it was very much a race to who would be more anti-Western, and this was reflected in the rhetoric of both sides. You had Mubarak, who I think no one can healthily say is a critic of the West, accusing the other side, and especially Mohammed al-Baradei, of being a pawn of the West. You had the demonstrators themselves accusing, of course, Mubarak of being pro-Western, pro-Israel. One of the most favorite slogans of the demonstrators was, don't speak to him in Arabic, he only understands Hebrew. So there was a lot of that, and I didn't really feel that I saw it. Maybe the Western media was expecting to see sort of, bunched up, black-clad millions shouting "Death to America," but it certainly wasn't that kind of attitude. But I think we saw on the Wednesday and the Thursday as the pro-Mubarak loyalists really started hitting out at foreign journalists, this anti-Westernism coming through, and that was something that was also found by the state media and by these suggestions that the demonstrators were American pawns. That this was a velvet revolution that had been funded by American NGOs. And in one case, one accusation that the demonstrators were very upset at, they were saying that each demonstrator had received 50 euros and a meal of Kentucky Fried Chicken to participate in the revolution. I think that this pretty much sums up the fundamental reasons behind this. Of course, it was about dignity. Of course, it was about democracy and the chance to have participation in a legislative system, in a parliamentary democracy. But, for God's sake, if that had been the spark, it wouldn't have taken 30 years to happen. I think that Tunisia was massively influential, but also the rise in the price of basic foodstuffs was also crucial. They're already being called, these wave of revolts, already being called the cereal revolutions, not SERICERE. Well, that's inevitable, isn't it? Yeah. Next. I didn't take that because it was an inventive slogan. I just like the Belle Epoque buildings in the background. So here you have just one of those pictures of your late afternoon prayer, Maghrib, being prayed in Tahrir Square in front of the tanks that the army has bunched up in front of the Egyptian Museum. And this was a nightly ritual. So that takes us to the Tuesday night. I was on the Tuesday night. I went home. We heard suddenly, like wildfire, this rumor spread that there was going to be a concessionary speech. Tuned in our TV, waited for hours and hours and hours, and then finally it came a little bit after midnight, I think, Cairo time. Mubarak saying that effectively he's going to step down, but also that he's going to remain in Egypt and he's going to die on the earth of Egypt, which so far he seems to be keeping this promise. I called a couple of contacts, then a few people in the square to get reactions, and it very much looked like this was not going to be enough for the people in the square, at least. But very much for other sections of Egyptian society with whom I was speaking, it was enough, and they felt that there was a certain amount of kind of indignation at this point. People feeling, we've been robbed and looted for several days. We can't go out in the streets after the curfew. There are all these local militias closing up the streets. The banks are closed. You can't pull money out. The price of food is starting to go up. For God's sake, let these people leave the square. Mubarak had done something smart. By closing off all the businesses, he'd managed to kind of shift the blame onto the people in the square as if they were responsible for the collapse of the economy. And this was something that actually we saw working very much in the interest of the demonstrators for their benefit once this was lifted on the Sunday, the next Sunday. So that was the carrot, and then came the stick. Thousands of loyalists bunching up to the entrances of Tahrir Square as of Wednesday noon. I'd already seen them. I was staying on the other side of the Nile in Muhandisin, and I'd already seen them demonstrating in Gamia Dol Arabiya Highway on my way into Zamalek, and then beyond that. I went to the Qasr Nil Bridge across Zamalek. You can just see the Opera House looming behind the bridge. And the atmosphere was still, not very aggressive. There was a lot of debating going on and a lot of anger, but it wasn't that kind of super tense moments that you saw later on. And I openly spoke with pro-Mubarak demonstrators, and kind of being Greek, I seem to inhabit this kind of in-between sort of the West and the East kind of line. Greeks have also had a very long history of living in Egypt, and so I can't really speak for other Western journalists, but pretty much up until an hour until the violence broke out, I was mingling very openly amongst them, and some people were upset. They were saying, "Why are you here? Why are you photographing? This is an internal matter." When I would say, "Well, this is the biggest story in the world," this would only inflame them more. They would say that the world has no business intruding upon our country. But this is the moment when things started getting a little bit out of control. The pro-Mubarak demonstrators surged up against the... see, I've got an etymological problem here that I had throughout, and that is, I don't really know what to call them. Do I call them the defenders of the square? Do I call them the occupiers of the square? It was one of these things that kind of colors you as a journalist, and as of that day, when so many journalists began getting beaten up, it was very difficult to cover both sides of the story. You could only really ever be with the demonstrators. So I'll call them from now on the defenders of the square, and, you know, forgive me. So here you see them pushing up against the defenders, and there was a lot of sort of aggravation and efforts to inflame things, but the demonstrators themselves were very resolute. You can see them here bunched up in these long kind of somnolent lines, not really giving back, not insulting or shouting, even though further on, sort of on the front line, there's a lot of that going on. And here the pro-Mubarak loyalists have seen me. They're giving me the middle finger. A couple of them were drawing their hands across their neck in a threatening motion, suggesting what they do to me if they caught me. And at this point, the defenders of the square said to me, perhaps you might like to go a little bit further back because you're just inflaming things. Just your presence here is really upsetting people because they think that the West is responsible for this, and they think that Egypt is becoming destabilized. I just loved these very in-the-zone, kind of very serious, grave faces. There was a lot of tension. You could really, literally cut through it with a knife. And we knew that something was going to happen sooner or later. But these people were just standing their ground, and the ones who were exhausted by the constant emotional pressure as well as the violence of being pushed and buffeted back and forth would be taken back to be given a rest, and more people would fill in the front. And this went on for about an hour and a half, 2 hours. But this was the moment when they broke through, when the level of violence skyrocketed, and you know, it was quite clear from the faces of the people in the front lines that they weren't interested in constructive debate or any kind of dialogue. They were there to reclaim the square and reclaim their homeland as they viewed it. And so the two sides fell apart, and rocks filled the air. People started trying to protect themselves in any way they could, running back. And as we ran back, there was this realization that if this entrance to the square collapsed and they entered the square, it might turn into a massacre. So a few people rallied. They realized that it's absolutely crucial that the square remain intact on all 6 entrances. And you can see where the line before was right up against those tanks. Now it had fallen, I guess, at least a couple of 100 meters. But even in the middle of this complete chaos, and you can't, I mean, it's hard to photograph in these situations, but so the whole sky is burnt out in this picture, but it's literally full of rocks. But even in this case, there were people policing the demonstration. You can see the man with the armband on the right of the image just standing there. And in the next picture, he's dropped on the ground with I guess through a stone, a rock. And that really rallied people. That was actually the signature thing that got everybody just kind of rushing back to not man barricades, but create them at this point. And then suddenly you just got this surge of people thrusting forward. So people just used anything they could to ferry rocks to the front. And people of all ages participated. I like this picture. You can see kind of the chaos that's going on there. A man has been hit on his head by a stone. You'll see him in the next picture with his sort of his bald patch streaked with red. And then there are people holding up impromptu shields. There were so many stones coming down every moment. And of course, in the middle of this, there's a guy sort of strolling through on the phone to his wife saying, "I'll be home for dinner, darling." Suddenly this man just stood up on a tank and started holding up a sign, and he wasn't wearing a helmet, he wasn't wearing anything. It's just extraordinary. And he lasted for, I think, a good 5 or 10 minutes up there before stones took him down. But then in another tank, a sheikh stood up, started gesturing to the crowd, And that was actually the thing that he had sort of enough gravitas and enough dignity to kind of stop the stone throwing. And you can see in this next picture, no stones are being thrown. There's just a crackle of electricity and shouting and slogans. But at this point, I decided I should head back into the square because I was hearing that all sorts of extraordinary things were happening, including horse and camel charges in the square. So I headed back, and dusk was coming down, and there was this kind of incredible noise of stones being shattered as the pavements were being systematically broken up by teams of men, but also women. And then these stones were being sort of ferried to the 6 different entrances to the square, all of which at different points were becoming fronts for assaults on the square. There were also men praying, I guess, the kind of prayer of martyrdom. I remember 3 men in a row just shouting, Ginna Yanes, Ginna, like heaven, O people, we're going to heaven. And there was also the sound of clanging, which was sort of shorthand for we're being attacked from this direction, send more fighters. At which point I realized also that there were no foreign journalists left in the square, which was a bit of a jolt. This was one of the best covered stories in the world. This was no Iran 2009. Anyone could get into Egypt on a tourist visa. And so it was quite a jolt to realize at some point at the dusk of Wednesday that there was no one left in the square. And the Egyptians around me were speaking of a conspiracy. They were saying Obama's made a deal with Mubarak and they've pulled out the journalists and now it's going to be a bloodbath. So at this point, a little bit more worried about my own safety than the photographs. I tried to find some place where I could be relatively safe if they took over the square and started just, working their way through people. And I found this converted mosque, which had been turned into a clinic, and where people were kind of being taken to recover from their wounds, to have them bandaged. Most of them were rock wounds, but you also had a couple of gunshot incidents, which became many more as the night wore on. And there were sort of people tired, exhausted, cold, in shock. Of course, inevitably, I bumped into a PhD from MIT, who was this wonderful, lovely guy. I wish we'd managed to exchange some kind of details, but he kind of came and asked me if I'm okay and if I want to go out into the square. He would arrange for people to come with me. I forgot to mention that when I went to the square and I realized there were no more foreigners left, I asked some Egyptians, where can I go? And they said, go to the Egyptian Museum. That's where they're protecting the journalists. So I went to the Egyptian Museum and I saw a very tense scene in front between the soldiers who were being accused of the protesters of not doing enough to protect to protect them from these attacks that they were receiving. And I just felt it was a very ugly scene, so I left. And later I heard that they'd arrested 24 journalists and were keeping them in there. They'd stripped them of their cards and their cameras, and some people never got them back. So it wasn't exactly a safe haven. So then I headed back out into the square, and these were the scenes at different entrances to the square. They were all manned by lines of demonstrators. People were praying before going into battle. And then, sort of interestingly, they were displaying quite good tactical awareness. They were sending out snatch squads of 5 or 6 people into the alleys and streets around the square to grab pro-Mubarak loyalists and bring them back into the square. And at some point around 9 o'clock at night, this was just, every minute there would be 2 or 3 just being rushed into the square, surrounded by 30 or 40 people, kicking and punching them. Others were protecting them. And then they were taken off to be sort of interrogated. And so these interrogations were happening inside the travel agencies on Tahrir. A couple of them had been opened up and they were being used as impromptu interrogation cells. And I don't know about you, but I was personally quite impressed at the successful kind of way in which this man that had been a pro-democracy demonstrator a few hours ago had managed to turn into such a convincing interrogator, talking about the guy in the suit on the left with a cigarette. He was really quite threatening, and I was actually quite scared. But they were basically trying to ascertain to what extent these guys were doing this because they wanted to, or as they suspected, they had actually been put up to this by people related to the regime, and the names of Magrana, one of the ministers, and Ahmed Ez, the steel magnate and also a minister, and also the Speaker of the Parliament, were really being bandied around as the sort of the chief people responsible for this. Inevitably, Habib al-Adli, the Interior Minister. And some of these people actually had their state security cards, identity cards on them, which I thought was, first I thought I was being spun by the demonstrators. Then I thought it was amazingly stupid. But then it gave me a pretty good insight into the sort of mentality of the dictatorship, where you feel so invincible that you can even walk into a square full of revolutionaries, and think that if you show this card, they're going to be cowed into submission. So many of these people were just coming in their plain clothes with their state security cards, and these were being found and photographed later on. So after they got interrogated, they were sort of taken again through the square, protected and kicked and punched in turns to the entrances to the metro station, where they were, of course the metro was closed, it had been closed for days, but they sort of stacked them up there in this entrance that stank of urine and feces and blood. And they were surrounded by literally baying crowds who wanted to get at them and tear them apart. At this point, people had been fighting for about 10, 11 hours, and there were a lot of injuries, as you saw from the hospital, and there were a lot of really bruised feelings and egos. People really wanted to get at the loyalists. So I headed out once again, and this time I wanted to go to one of the main sort of battlegrounds at the entrance to the square. Here you can see the women kind of sounding the alarm. They're approaching, send more people to stem the flow. All kinds of impromptu helmets were being used. And barricades. The demonstrators were very lucky in that a lot of construction was going on in Tahrir Square. So you had these kind of blue and white metal boards that were being used to block off the areas under construction, which were then taken and used to put up barricades. And you can see that, again, the stones up in the air. It was quite difficult to photograph. The light wasn't good, obviously. But just a note again on tactics, you had spotters on the left and the right. You have the man in the center who's standing up, obviously exposing himself to a lot of stones. But he's got a good view of the streets beyond, and he knows when the loyalists have retreated beyond the range of the stones. So then he'll put up his hands, they'll stop throwing stones, and they'll send out little squads to pick up those stones littering around, both deny the loyalists of stones to throw back, sort of clear the area, dead ground, bring them back and put them in those nice little neat piles until the next attack comes. So they were actually quite organized, and again, it was difficult to do scientific research, but anecdotally, the Muslim Brotherhood or Muslim Brotherhood affiliated members were instrumental in organizing the defense. So this is the Egyptian Museum. I kind of wandered over to this area here later, and you can see that there is, it's the broadest entry into the square. It's also the most exposed, and it was by far the most violent. This is where the camels and the horses came in from. And again, there's beautiful buildings in the backgrounds, inside of which many demonstrators had climbed up and were going out into the balconies and throwing stones and Molotov cocktails onto the Mubarakists, who had also taken over a couple of buildings on the other side, and there were sort of fights going on the roofs, which were best captured by the journalists in the Ramses Hilton, which was about a kilometer over there. And then green lasers were being used by the Mubarakist side to highlight areas, I guess mostly the buildings. It was very difficult to hear if there were gunshots ringing out, but there were several gunshot wounds, so we assumed that members of the loyalists had their weapons on them. And it was just this sort of bizarre scene because you had burned out armored personnel carriers and military trucks and vehicles, and they were being used as barricades, but also being pushed forward by squads of 50 to 60 people as the anti-Mubarak demonstrators were gaining ground. And so here's a shot of the Mubarakists attacking. You've got those highly mobile and highly flimsy barricades on the bottom. And they're all just bunched up on the 6th of October bridge overpass on the top. Again, all sorts of improvisation on the helmet front. And this is the front line. Again, very, very highly mobile. They could move these back and forward as and when the dictates of the battle. There were fires. I haven't really captured, I'm sort of tragically, I managed to erase one of my cards from that night. I'm going to try to reclaim the data. Actually, I'm at MIT. Can anyone reclaim my data? Please, because it's just 1 hour from like Maghreb until the hospital ends. Hasn't. Thanks. It's embarrassing. So you can see all the stones littering everywhere, and again, all kinds of barricades being brought forward and back. We've got our backs to a barricade, and this was interesting. Like, people would see us as, not the royal we, smoke, thunder and fire and so on, and rocks falling all around. And then my good Iranian friend Puya Tabatabai kind of steps through the smoke and says, "Iason, how are you? I haven't seen you since 2009. So this is bizarre. So Puya, who's just a nutter, had decided to come to Egypt, even though Iranians and Egyptians are, as we said, not on very good relations. He luckily has a Canadian passport. He's a great photographer, and so we kind of, ran around together. And of course, I regretted massively the fact that we occasionally spoke to each other in Farsi or shouted to each other in Farsi, because I'm sure that we've spawned all sorts of urban myths where, those people who will later become the generals and ministers of the Tahrir Square revolution will be saying, "Do you remember that key Wednesday night? I'm sure I heard Farsi being spoken. Maybe those Mubarak had a point after all." So, so Puya and I kind of were being protected by the demonstrators who saw us. At some point, they were offering us stones to throw. I said, I can't do this, I'm a journalist. And then someone actually came with me and just held a shield over me so I could photograph, or put me in a building and said, "Go and get a better shot from up there." They were really protecting us. Small aside, I also bumped into a very friendly guy called Mohammed who spoke fluent Greek. He heard me speaking on my phone. This was on a later day. And Mohammed and I went, and he was one of the security elements of the popular committees. And he'd sort of done his PhD. The reason why he spoke Greek is that he'd done his PhD on Ottoman mosque architecture in the Dodecanese at Athens University. And so we spent 5 or 6 hours with Mohammed, and he got me out of trouble many times. And I felt very grateful to him, but obviously he would never accept, money for what he'd done. So I thought, maybe we could call up his dissertation supervisor in Greece, whom he hadn't seen for several months. And so we did, and he was very happy and was speaking to her and saying how much he thanked her for everything that she taught him, and how much he thanked for the money that she'd given him when he was running low on cash, and how now he was doing well, and he was a professor at one of the universities and so on. But then as he was speaking to this quite straight-laced Greek academic, he started saying, "But most of all, I want to thank you, and I want to thank Greece for teaching me how to make Molotov cocktails and how to throw them and how to demonstrate." And how to beat up people, because I'm fighting for democracy, I'm fighting for my country, and I've learned everything that I'm doing now, I've learned in Greece in the demonstrations. So that's another positive from the Greek economic crisis of 2010. Anyway, back to Tahrir. Right. Very popular. The Egyptians have a sort of blissfully unironic interpretation of Facebook. They're fans big time. And I heard that recently someone just named their kid Facebook. But in this case, Facebook was sort of a lifesaver, because at some point, Puya and I wandered back into the square, and it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and there was no sign of the battle abating. But we were getting quite worried, because now we had fantastic stuff. We'd seen no other photographers, so we assumed that we were the only photographers that had these incredible shots of the demonstrators fighting from inside the square, not those super telephoto lenses from the Ramses. So we wanted to make sure that we didn't get beaten up and have our stuff confiscated on the way out. It was very difficult to get accurate information on which bridges were open and which weren't, and quite frankly, we didn't want to risk it. So I remember that on my Facebook, right before heading off to the riots, someone had written in from Greece saying, "Well, so-and-so, my good friend Bia lives on Tahrir Square." And that was something that sort of ignored, assuming that, well, you know how these things go. Someone claims that they're on Tahrir, but in fact they're in sort of 2 streets further down, and it's beyond the tanks, and you can't really go. So I just assumed it was going to be a very long shot. But then when things got as bad as they did, I called up the number and Bia answered immediately. She said, no, absolutely, we're on number 1 Talat Harb Street. Come and find us there. I'll let the Bawab know. I'll let the gate man know that you're coming. So we trudged up this Belle Epoque building, dusty and sooty and very, very dirty, and suddenly just emerged into sort of, as Alice through the looking glass, into this beautiful apartment owned by the man sitting there, Pierre Soufi, who is a sort of an actor and an art collector and a Facebook organizer. And we sort of stumbled on one of these sort of Facebook command centers of the revolution, which later became, there was a New York Times thing about it, and everybody came and photographed the square from Pierre's balcony, because in a way that became security for him. He realized that if this revolution should fail, if there should be a counter-revolution and death squads and so on, the fact that he had such a prominent print on the square on the international media would act as some kind of not to suggest that he thought about things in such a calculating way. Things were very fast moving, and you acted very much on instinct. But we ended up in this flat, which had an extraordinary view over the square. And as it got to around 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, this sense of doom came over the square, because people felt that with no foreign journalists there, the military was going to move in and sweep the square very violently. So this was reinforced by 7 or 8 ambulances swarming in at around 4 o'clock, about an hour before dawn. They loaded up people that had been shot by snipers from across the square, possibly from the Egyptian Museum roof or the top of the Ramses Hilton, or even the 6th of October overpass, who knows. So things were very heavy, but suddenly news came through that the demonstrators had rallied and they'd taken the 6th of October overpass, and they sort of broken through the confines of into the next square in front of the Ramses Hilton. And that was really the game changer, because at that point everybody knew that this square was not going to fall to violence, and this took the dynamic into concessions on the part of the government and negotiations. And so it was almost like the siege of Tahrir, this very medieval siege that we'd lived through, had been postponed. And the demonstrators had demonstrated that they were not to be moved violently. So dawn breaks, and we head back into the square, and at this point it's very, very much a morning after the night before. These are more suspected collaborators stacked in that entrance to the metro. And some of the survivors, almost no one without a bandage over some part of their head, holding up a blood-smeared flag and shouting defiant slogans at around 7 o'clock in the morning, shouting that defiance, we're still here, you haven't moved us. And they felt, you have to understand that they really felt very isolated, because there was no media, and the local media, the state media, was telling people that these people are all saboteurs and Westerners and Iranians and perverts. So these people really felt that they had something to prove, and if they got kicked out by violence, nothing would change. Oh, here you go. No breakfast being given out after the night before. And this was the front that we'd been at the previous night. That's the Ramses Hilton behind, from where the journalists were photographing. A few hours later, mobs entered the Ramses Hilton and tried to attack the journalists and roughed up several of them. That was the most violent day, the Thursday. And then, again, more survivors. Spotters still up there on their cars. And that's the museum on the back. And again, tactically, they've been very smart. They've pushed it to the utmost extent before it becomes tactically indefensible, before the square broadens out again. So they've taken the maximum amount of territory they can get. Later on, the Egyptian army moved its tanks in and kind of pushed them back. People lay under their tracks so that the tanks couldn't advance into the square itself. So it's Friday, and it's a big celebratory Friday prayer. The second week was the most crucial one, and people flocked into the square as of the Friday, knowing that they had to bring in supplies, that there were people in that square that had no water, no food, very few sanitary facilities. So the Friday was important. But so was the Sunday that followed, because the Sunday was the day that the government said, right, that's it, we're going back to work, the banks are opening up. And sort of counterintuitively, this led to the government losing its main hold on people's psychology, which told people that this collapse of the country has to do with the people in the square. The government, just by opening the banks, demonstrated that, in fact, it was in control of asphyxiating the country or not. And that was when the square turned into a fairground, with all everybody coming in, very inquisitive to find out who these people were, to speak to them, to find out what their experiences were, what they actually wanted, whether they were Egyptian after all or not. And also that's when you also got, the people sort of selling popcorn and flags, and it literally became a fairground. Anthony Shadid has written fantastic articles about that. So, of course, fighting didn't stop. That wasn't the end of it. That was just the most dramatic night. You had more fighting on the Friday and the Saturday. At some point, the demonstrators pushed all the way to Tahrir Square and took it, and pushed even further into the streets, kind of networking off that. And they became tactically very savvy. You can see the rocks, the piles of rocks there. You can see the perimeter barricades, barricade upon barricade upon barricade, with bag checks and ID checks all the way in. That's actually Tahrir Square, where the Greek club is. They're doing Maghrib prayers. And some people camped out in February in the square for 12, 13, 14 nights in a row. And then some people brought in their laptops and started twittering from the square and Facebooking. And that was Pierre's house. I ended up sleeping a few nights there because there was too much going on to actually go back to Mohandesin. That's one of the dawns from his window, from his balcony. And you can see the tent city that developed in the square itself. Some eclectic decorations. I took these pictures because Pierre's house literally represented an Egypt that no longer exists. And it is perhaps an Egypt that some of the demonstrators are anxious to revive. Pierre is a Coptic Christian with Greek roots, and his whole house, his decoration, and the kind of people that he gathered around him, who were of all religions and of all different nationalities, very much harked back to this Egypt of the 1940s and the 1950s. Lawrence Durrell has written about it in his Alexandria Quartet. Stratis Tsirkas, the Greek communist writer, has written about it in his own trilogy. Kavafi was very much a product of it, the famous Greek poet. Where you had not just Alexandria, where the Maltese were next to the Jews, next to the Greeks, the Armenians, and the French and the English Italians, and so on, but you also had the local bakalis, the local kind of grocer in a village in Upper Egypt, being a Greek. You had serious penetration by ethnic minorities of the whole of society. That's before Nasser came, before Pan-Arabism, before the idea that everyone's equal and all benefits are cancelled. But that's why I found Pierre's house not just a hideaway, but also a time portal into a very different Egypt. And down in the square again, demonstrators saying to me, "Where's the Kentucky Fried Chicken? This is what we're eating." Bread and cheese. And that was the Sunday when traffic started again and people started flocking into the square to discover who these people were. I've taken up more than I should have of your time. Thank you very much. And I'd love to take questions even.
Hello? Can you hear me if I stand up like this? Okay, great. So my name is David Weinberg. I'm a doctoral student here. In my prior life, I worked as a Middle East advisor to the Democratic chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, including on Egypt policy. Before working for him, I had actually lived in Egypt in the Islam slum of Imbaba. what miserable Arabic I speak, I'm told, is smacks of an Egyptian accent, and I can't shake it no matter how hard I try, so I might as well embrace it. And so since Iason gave us such a fantastic and eloquent, fine-grained analysis and narrative of everything that he saw there, I'm going to kind of take a step back and talk about the geostrategic environment and consequences of this as I see it, and as best I can tell how a lot of Washington sees it. So no doubt this is a fantastic liberation of a people, right? I mean, this is, it's in Liberation Square if you translate it, right? And this is people claiming their popular sovereignty, rising up against a dictator whose forces widely use torture and intimidation against their own society, who crushed public political parties and freedom of association and many of these sorts of things. So that is unabashedly, undeniably fantastic and positive. On the other hand, however, there are a lot of aspects of this that have people in Washington worried, in part because the future is not entirely clear, in part because it's easy to maybe run away with the worst case scenario in one's head and fear that as a likely outcome rather than a probable outcome. For years, the United States has relied upon Egypt and on this regime for a lot of its posture in the region. Since 1979, Egypt has received between $1 and $2 billion in aid from the United States every year, much of which has been military aid. The United States, in effect, Egypt was, behind Israel, the #2 recipient of all U.S. foreign aid, behind, say, NATO allies or war zones like Iraq, consistently year over year over year. So this is a really, really deep relationship with this regime that the United States had and relied upon. The United States relied upon the Egyptian regime for a number of things, including right now troop transport to Iraq through Suez Canal, as well as overflight rights or grants. And in addition, cooperation on counterterrorism issues and especially the peace process. I'd like to read you a really striking quote I found in the course of my own research on the peace process about the Egyptian role at some points throughout the last 20, 30 years and how many in the U.S. government saw it. So this is from former Assistant Secretary of Near Eastern Affairs, so in effect, the top Middle East diplomat at the State Department during the George H.W. Bush administration, but I think it's to a certain extent representative of how a lot of people in Washington thought about this. He said in an oral history looking back upon his career, "I must commend the Egyptians for their creative and important initiatives. They were major players on all aspects of the peace process. The Egyptian government was willing to run risks. They always brought imaginative and creative solutions to the table. They provided major contributions time and time again. They would give us ideas to overcome blockages in the process. They would almost always suggest new tactics and strategies, regardless whether the obstruction had been built by Israel, the PLO, or another Arab country. They would sometimes even front for us. Mubarak might propose a course of action to a country on our behalf. He was a man of action. I really admired their willingness to stick their necks out." So, this is a key mediator and a key ally from the American perspective in the peace process. Now, as many of you know, the peace process right now is pretty much at a standstill for a variety of reasons that we can get into if you'd like. But this is certainly something that is a major element that needs to be taken into consideration when we think about how this may impact the geostrategic environment. In addition, now, especially now that Libya is engaged in its own turmoil, there's significant reason to worry about oil markets. As everyone here well knows, we've been through some pretty awful economic times in the last few years, both in the United States but also globally. Obviously, many of these revolts were inspired and instigated in part because of economic deprivation. And if oil goes through the roof due to further collapses, say, in Saudi Arabia, other difficulties in transport in the Persian Gulf, including continued stoppage of oil transport just from Libya, which is a major producer, this is something that could have implications for the global economy. So that's another aspect of it that people in Washington are going to be watching very carefully and watching with some concern. Now, it's important to remember that the last presidential administration, the second George W. Bush term, pushed hard for a very brief time for democracy in Egypt. Condi Rice went to the American University in Cairo and said that it's the time for change, we need to have competitive elections in Egypt and really need to have an opening up of the democratic process. Now, what happened was Iraq went south from there. And in effect, the administration turned their back, were exceptionally hypocritical with regard to democracy in Egypt at the time, and basically abandoned forces of democratization. So you saw in the first rounds of the parliamentary election in 2005 that year, relatively free voting, and in fact the Muslim Brotherhood succeeded, especially through the first round, in basically winning 20% of the parliament in Egypt, of the lower house. And then the regime struck back, used violence, used goons, they used torture, all of these sorts of things. It used vote rigging, and in effect, these democracy gains were rolled back. But it's important to remember that we had this brief period where the U.S. got behind this, and then where we basically caved. The army, it's important to remember, were a key underpinning of the prior regime. And although Mubarak and a couple of his closest allies now have their assets frozen in Europe or are being investigated, it's important to remember that many of the people currently leading the Egyptian government, the provisional government, are still people of the old regime. So Omar Suleiman, the acting president, was in effect Mubarak's right-hand man for intelligence security issues for well over a decade. So it's important to remember that a lot of the faces are still there, and they're still at the helm. As he also noted, the role of the military is relatively revered within society, in part because of the perceived victory in 1973 that in its last war. And I'm sure you probably heard people in the square shouting something like, "Shabul Geish il Wahda," right? I mean, the people in the army are one hand. They're that close together, right? So the military really has a very high credibility within society, but it's possible for that to go south if the military doesn't move on issues of democratization quickly. Now, U.S. military aid, at this point, it's important to realize there's some talk in Congress about it perhaps getting rolled back. I think that personally would be a mistake, in part because since the army is still so influential at this point in Egypt, the last thing we want to do is to completely alienate them. What we want to ideally achieve is to cajole, push, urge, and pressure them in constructive ways towards a political process that is open, that's free, and that actually moves. The Muslim Brotherhood, as you noted, was a major player in a lot of this process, and they deserve fantastic commendation for that. They also were very tactically intelligent by yielding sort of the political face of the movement to Mohammed al-Baradei, who's viewed a lot more favorably in the West. They're probably not as best I can tell, representative of a majority of the Egyptian population, but they're certainly the strongest political plurality force out there, other than the regime. They have deep roots in society, and they also have substantial credibility with portions of the population. As a Jewish American, I'd have to note that some of the rhetoric and issues that they raise, things like blood libel, protocols of the Elders of Zion, things like that, worry me as racist and anti-Semitic, and that's something that is certainly a concern, right? I mean, it's a pluralistic movement that has different wings, but it's if you have a party like that take power of a country, it's important to understand that their worldview may be impacted by this. Now, the secular opposition is absolutely decimated. in my opinion. I mean, you basically have an enormous vacuum of secular leadership. Now, this is a society that is not a totalitarian society in the most extreme sense of the word over the recent years. It's been a horrible autocracy, but there has been a relatively vibrant civil society. There have been sort of kernels of these organizations for real political movement, but the political parties are extremely weak organizationally as well as in their public profile. And if we went to elections today, they simply, in my estimation, would not be ready to contest effectively. Let's see. So I'm going to talk briefly about the Iranian and the Israeli angles, which I think are very important here as well, and then I'll yield to Kristin. Now, in Iran, it's reported that tens of thousands of people turned out to protest as well. They met with much less success than protesters did in Egypt. As I'm sure you could attest, the Green Movement is still present. It's still a force, but it is limping. And so, it's possible for this sort of change to occur in Iran, but it doesn't seem like it's in process at the moment. And strategically in the region, Iran is riding high. Which is, a country that's effectively seen by many in Washington as America's enemy number one in the region, in Iraq, and in the Gulf, in the Levant, in the peace process. This is a country that basically many of America's allies in the region for containing Iran, that the U.S. has kind of relied on for its hold in the Gulf, are now scared. Bahrain is in complete turmoil. The Saudis are frightened, as are many of the sheikdoms. And so it'll be interesting to watch as this process unfolds what America's posture in the Gulf looks like and whether we stay. My guess is yes, but it'll be interesting to watch. And lastly, there's the Israeli angle, right, and the Palestinian angle. This is an event that has enormous implications for the peace process as well as the lives of Palestinians and Israelis. Now, the Egyptian military has indicated they intend to honor all treaties, most notably the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. That's notable. I don't think under any circumstances we're likely to see that treaty abrogated. You are, however, not going to see a quiet, peaceful, trusting border between the Israelis and the Egyptians in the same way that we've seen in the past. There are risks for significant arms racing, even if you have a friendly regime in Cairo to the Israelis, as well as perhaps limitations on the Israeli government's strategic ambitions, including bombing Syria or Iran or attacks in Gaza or the West Bank. So this is something that's going to be in their calculus. And additionally, I think it'll have some mixed impact on the peace process. It could have extremely positive consequences. It seems like it's currently having extremely negative consequences. We have a Palestinian Authority leadership that was already concerned about domestic legitimacy and their domestic control. We had a leak of what was called the Palestine Papers to Al Jazeera News, which also was spun in a way that completely undermined some of the Palestinian Authority leadership. And now we have the Palestinian Authority concerned about uprisings from below. And so we're going to see both from the Palestinian side and the Israeli side, for various reasons, reluctance to make sort of bold moves that would be seen as, by the other side, as a concession to them for peace. Then on the Israeli side, in effect, the Israelis withdrew from Gaza, they withdrew from Lebanon after many years, and they view it in retrospect as huge strategic blunders. They basically feel, well, we unilaterally did something positive, and now we get rained down with rockets from each place. And now whether or not that justification or logic is valid, that's kind of the main narrative in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv right now. Especially with Egypt now being a somewhat less reliable border for the Israelis, the especially thinkers within the Likud are going to be that much more reluctant, unfortunately, to consider withdrawals from the West Bank out of fear that perhaps their one last frontier over which they have considerable hegemony will be an area over which they no longer have that sort of strategic control, and they may see missiles fired not just on the deep Israeli south or north, but missiles on what they see as sort of the heartland of their country, so Tel Aviv, West Jerusalem, and Haifa. So, well, it should, ideally, I think if many of us could have our druthers, the Israelis would see this as, wow, this is realization that the order on which we relied was unsustainable, and we need to make moves towards peace. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like that's the way the Israeli mainstream in politics is going to go, and especially where this current Israeli leadership is pointing. I'd like to close by noting the inherent uncertainty of what's going on here. Should this have been predicted? Sure, there were deep structural factors that led to this rebellion, to this revolution, including extensive unemployment, a really, really oppressive government, an enormous youth bulge, these sorts of electronic communications technologies that really kind of spurred this on further. But these things are stochastic. They're probabilistic, and it's really, really difficult for any sort of observer to really know when and where it's going to happen. Did we know it was going to happen in Egypt? No. In fact, most people, even after Tunisia happened within the policy community in the US, didn't see it coming. And so I think there are some useful parallels to the Iranian Revolution here, not because this will necessarily turn out the same way, but there's a fantastic book that I would recommend to you all by a sociologist named Charles Kurtzman called The Unthinkable Revolution in Iran, where he basically goes through a lot of the thinking that happened both in British foreign policy and in American foreign policy toward Iran during the course of the revolution. And what he found is that basically, not only did they not see it coming, they completely misread it every step of the way. They thought, well, maybe it looks like there will be a nationalist military coup and that's what will take over. Or it looks like the communists are going to take over. Or it looks like Khomeini is a real Democrat and he's really going to be the way to go. Right. It's pretty remarkable in retrospect to read something like that in the archives. So at this point, this is a half-finished revolution in Egypt as well as in a couple of other Arab countries. We know that things are going to change, but in terms of how they're going to change, we don't yet entirely know, and it's going to be fascinating over the coming months to see how this develops. Thank you.
Hi again, everybody. Like I said, my name is Kristin Fabbe. I'm a PhD candidate also here in political science at MIT. And my expertise is on comparative politics of the Middle East. Thanks, David, for that excellent geostrategic vantage point, and Iason for a really vivid presentation. So since our time is limited, I do want to open things up for questions pretty quickly here. And for those of you who have questions, if you'll please go to the microphone and please state your affiliation before you ask your question, and keep your questions short so we can squeeze in as many as possible. But just sort of as a testament to Iasonis's bravery in seeing all of this, I'd just like to tell a small anecdote. So I was also in Egypt, however, the days before Iasonis arrived. So when things broke out on the Tuesday, the police day, the first demonstrations, and up until that Sunday evening. And I called Iasonis on the phone, and he said, oh, where are you? And I said, I'm on my way out of the country. He said, well, why are you leaving? I said, my goodness, how could I stay? Right. And so, I mean, I really do think, and if anybody has questions about what things were like on the ground in those first days, I'd be happy to talk about them. I did see a little bit of action in front of the lawyers' syndicate with concussion grenades and rubber bullets, and that's what sent me running to the airport. So without further ado, I'd like to open things up for questions to anybody who has them. Yes, please just head up to the mic.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
My name's Eric Slater. I'm a laid-off bus driver from Chicago. I had two basic questions. To the first speaker, mostly I'm bringing this towards. You mentioned popular committees. You also, in your slideshow, discussed how there was armband. You talked about tactics quite a bit. Seeing this first, that's my main question. Obviously, there's just a brief moment when you were repeatedly talking about how people were afraid, and it's a very serious fear, that much larger arms would be used, that there wouldn't just be a rock fight, right? That this people would be murdered on a large scale. And that was, I would like you to talk about that. And I don't know if you can answer this question. I'm trying to answer it, but why did that moment occur, right? Why for instance, did not the forces of Mubarak and also the U.S. military intervene, and why they felt at this moment they had the safety to do so? But the basic question is, you mentioned Facebook command centers. I don't believe it, frankly. As an organizer in Chicago, I think that may have been a useful tactic, but in street battles like that, it takes organization, it takes leadership which is trusted, it takes quite a bit of experience. I think your example of Greece, that may explain some of it, right? They may have gotten the information. So basically, what do you mean by popular committees? And if you could expand on that, especially what they did afterwards, if some of the police had left and some of the functions of police, obviously some of the functions to beat your head in, but others is very useful, right? It's we need to do those things. And did they handle that, and how did they do so?
So, I think I used the expression command center a little bit glibly. It wasn't like a command center to actually coordinate what was going on inside the square. It was more a command center to get news out into the world of what's going on through Facebook groups and social networks and so on. So these people were obviously in the square with this fantastic vantage point from the 9th floor looking out over everything, regularly going out. They were all hooked into different aspects of the different demographics in the square, the different political groupings and intellectuals and Islamists and so on. And they were coming back and they were basically kind of coordinating amongst themselves a more coherent strategy and coming up with initiatives that were looking sort of 2-3 days down the line, instead of the people on the square who were basically just dealing with holding on to the square and making sure that things were kept kept intact. Your other question, the second part, was on the issue of the police and popular committees?
Well, certainly popular committees.
Yeah, popular committees were set up on, as much as I could understand, on an impromptu basis after the looting that followed the weekend after the first day of Rage. The fear that you mentioned broke on the day of Rage itself, when they got this very hated police and Amna Dawla and Mukhabarat and plainclothes, they sent them running. Beyond that, at some point the government must have said to the Interior Ministry, people get lost, get out of the street, because you're actually inflaming things more than you're actually managing to repress them. But speaking to your point about the issue of the military, of course, gets to remain squeaky clean and loved because the Ministry of Interior is doing the repressing. They protect the country's borders and haven't had to do anything since 1973. When they managed to bow out of the series of 4 Egyptian-Israeli wars with their best performance so far. They still lost. Cairo could still have been occupied by the Israelis had they wanted to, but they lost with great heroism. And so did the Syrians in the Golan Heights. And this is the narrative that was created at the time, the army that protects the country and so on. But exactly, this speaks to your point of what would happen now that the Ministry of Interior has been shattered. I think it just got burned yesterday for a second time, or parts of it got burned. So it'll be interesting to see how the army, which has already banned workers' demonstrations, can actually enforce these in the absence of convincing law enforcement authority. Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, George Bryant from Revolution Books. I'm just thrilled to see what's going on there. For me, it's the best thing that's happened in the world in the last 40 years, actually, in terms of people at the grassroots level rising up. Now, I think we need to sort this out, because I can understand why the leaders in Washington are worried. They think it's terrible. But going back to this point about all this fear of the religious, if you look at what the U.S. has done in that region in the last 40 years, they've made sure there has been no leftist or secular opposition. They've put people in power like Saddam Hussein and Mubarak and the Shah of Iran, who just tortured and crushed the life out of any kind of secular opposition. We need to take a look at that. Absolutely. I think we've got to kind of read between the lines of what they call counterintelligence cooperation between the U.S. and Egypt. What it meant is the U.S. was sending people to Egypt to be tortured under the Extraordinary Rendition Program. Mm-hmm. And the man that coordinated that was Mr. Suleiman. Yeah. I think the people in the square in Tahrir knew that. Very few people in this country know that. Yeah. So let's cut through what they call counterterrorism. let's cut through this thing, what the peace process, so important peace process that Mubarak helped the U.S. do with Israel. This was a way of just crushing the Palestinians, stealing more of their land. If you look at how much land has been taken since this so-called peace process began with Sadat and Mubarak, it's just torturous. Not to mention massacring people in Gaza with the active cooperation of the Egyptian military. So they have their perspective in Washington. That shouldn't be our perspective. And the question in this room shouldn't be, how do we, we the people here should realize we have very different interests from the people in Washington, because they actually are responsible for the American empire. They preside over an empire. There's a reason they have a fifth fleet in Bahrain. Now we know, right? How do you explain such a phenomenon? America is the new Rome. Now, that shouldn't be the interest of freedom-loving people in this society. So we need to sort out some of these questions. I don't know how much this was coming among the people in the square, how they were seeing this. There's part of this wanting to see the military, wanting to see the U.S. be on their side, but realistically, there's no historical precedent for that. I think they're up against a lot in terms of figuring out how do you contend with these forces. The military is heavily invested in the economy, which has just been choking the life out of the Egyptian people. The military owns factories. The military is involved with the so-called tourism industry, where people work these diddly jobs and get nothing for it. They need a whole new framework. They'll have to come up with a new leadership. This is a very big challenge, but it's exciting that people are actually confronting things on that level rather than how do we get through the next day and try to forget about all the weight on our backs. I think.
And any government that is even microscopically more democratic than the Mubarak regime is going to take a harsher line against Israel, because that will be a reflection of the will of the people. That's another issue that I'm sure people in Washington are very much aware of. Yeah.
There's just a lot on the table. I think it's an exciting moment. We should really look at it more truthfully and not accept kind of the doublespeak that comes out of CNN and the people, the forces in Washington. What are they worried about? They have their own interests, but that shouldn't be what defines our position on it.
May I follow up? I think all of your points are interesting points, and I'd like to kind of engage on them a little bit. I think the point about rendition is spot on. I think the United States has a very weak leg to stand on when we criticize torture in other countries, including in Egypt, when in fact we enlisted them as subcontractors for torture on our own behalf, certainly. That having been said, counterterrorism cooperation with Arab regimes, including but not limited to Egypt, is something that I think is in the interest not just of the government of the United States, but of the people of the United States. I'd point to Mutallab, the would-be underpants bomber from Yemen, right? The reason that plot didn't blow up an airplane over Chicago was because we had great counterterrorism cooperation with Yemeni and Saudi authorities. I think that's something that's in the interest of all American people, that a plane didn't blow up there. Regarding Gaza and the peace process, I certainly agree with you. Israel's strategic coordination with Mubarak has been, over history, an enabling force for some of Israel's actions that have been deeply destructive, including Operation Cast Lead in Gaza. I agree with you in that regard. That having been said, the peace process, in my opinion, is a relatively constructive process. Certainly, the Oslo process was a joke in terms of stopping settlement construction and further appropriation of Palestinian land. There's no denying that. That having been said, as we look towards the future and where we go from here, I think that it may be important to include Hamas in a process at some point, for example. But the way a Palestinian state is going to be achieved, as best I can tell, is going to be negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority, including, as well, perhaps pressure from the United States, but also reassurance of both parties that they're going to be able to make concessions on deep nationalist claims and be able to survive in a peaceful environment afterwards. So I do think that there are some positive things that came out of this, but I think there are some aspects of it that do need to be taken into consideration in this regard.
Please.
Yeah.
My name is Charlie Welch, and my understanding is what we saw in the square is just the tip of the iceberg of what's going on in the country. There were things going on all around the country, including massive labor upsurges, and the media seemed to did not be able to cover anything beyond the square. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
So if you could kind of restate it.
What was going on in the rest of the country, including strikes?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the strikes are a significant component of what happened, but I think the core of what's going on in Egypt is in the exact Midana Tahrir where Iason was. Egypt is an enormous country with an enormous population and enormous civilization. There are different parts of the country with somewhat different subcultures, but that having been said, Cairo is such an enormous center of Egypt. There's a saying that Masr or Al-Qahira is ad-dunya, it's the mother of the world. And I think to some extent it's got such a gravity to it that in effect Egypt is a city-state. And whence Cairo goes, Egypt goes. Now that having been said, labor protest has been an enormous component of keeping this revolution going. And it's certainly going to continue to be, considering that the Egyptian economy is in deep freeze right now. Same thing in Tunisia. And if popular sovereignty and these popular revolutions are going to be sustained in a way that really fosters meaningful democracy, I think the United States is going to have to meaningfully look at providing significant economic aid as well as political pressure in ways that help sustain this sort of process and also starts to meet the concerns of some of these labor organizers that they don't get the short end of the stick during this process.
Thank you. I just wanted to start by thanking you, Mr. Athanasiadis, for the eyewitness account. It was really telling. I just wanted to ask about what, in your opinion, was the spark that brought the people out, because a lot of the factors that you've mentioned, the rising cost of foodstuffs, the repressive security apparatus, the youth bulge, those are present in other countries. Yeah. Syria comes to mind, for example, and we didn't see anything happen there. So when you talk to the people, when you saw them coming out in the streets, either the initial, the people who really built the movement from the ground, or the people who eventually joined in the celebration, when you ask them, why are you here? Why are you bringing your children here when the tanks are right here? How did we get 1 million people in this square? What were their answers to those kind of questions? Thanks.
I mean, it's hard to say because I also wasn't in Egypt until after it went really massive on that Friday. I got into Egypt like Sunday night. But I'd say that what was psychologically very important was the whole experience of Tunis. Next door, Tunis is a country that has always traditionally been seen by the Egyptians as really kind of puny little Tunisia. We are the Egyptian juggernaut, the behemoth. Where we go, they follow. They were particularly humiliated, I remember, when I was living there in 2001 at news in Al-Ahram newspaper that Tunisian businessmen had, or bank sort of managers had been sent over to Egypt to help Egyptian banks become more productive. That was seen as a massive national affront. And so there was, I think, an element of, for God's sake, if they're doing it, we should be doing it too. But the psychological fear really broke on the Friday, on the Day of Rage. The 25th, which was the initial demonstration a few days before the Friday, was key, but many of your traditional activists who were kind of middle class and upper middle class had already actually gone home by the time that the working class emerged. And there were a series of interesting articles in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times about a week and a half ago that traced how these groups tried a new technique in that they did trial runs and they went into neighborhoods like Imbaba and Shobra al-Khayma and other kind of slums, working class areas, and rallied people, did a lot of digital, hid their signs digitally by only communicating face-to-face, set out a lot of different messages to confuse those tracing their cell phones, where they were going to rally and so on. So they became more sophisticated in organizing and managed to make that crucial link that the Green Movement in Iran has largely failed to do between themselves and the working class. One more point that I want to just address to the first questioner was that the reason why, as you asked, the army did not repress this as carelessly, carefreely as the Iranians did, is that for all intents and purposes, Egypt is a Western ally. And while, of course, we know that the U.S. only pays lip service to the idea of human rights and so on. This lip service is very important. So we will send off our people, our rendered suspects, to be tortured there. But this happens under a permissive and quiet media environment where it's not particularly front-page news. You cannot send in the army to Tahrir Square and turn into Tiananmen. You cannot do it if you're an American ally. Iran, of course, isn't, and so they can. Plus, that was a completely different system that the Iranian Green Movement used. They weren't fixed in one square. They didn't try to take it over and turn it into a focal point. There were no live feeds. You couldn't sit in your drawing room in Cambridge and participate in the Egyptian Revolution. You didn't have thousands of journalists there. There were so many ways in which the Mubarak regime could have killed this off bloodfully but quickly, and they didn't. And the Iranians, I think, could teach them a lot of lessons in how to do that.
If I could second you on your earlier point about organizing, I think the reason that we aren't seeing this in Syria, but we did see it in Egypt, Libya is a different one, so that would have to be explained differently, but it's a story of the organizer, right? I mean, Egypt really doesn't have the sorts of political parties that it's going to need for a sustained democracy, but it did have very meaningful pockets and networks of civil organizers, as well as the Muslim Brotherhood organizational capacity. And both of those were absolutely essential for turning this into a revolution.
And also just to sort of second Iason's point about the demonstration effect. So when I was in Cairo on that Monday, Tuesday, and even the previous Sunday, so I went to a series of lectures throughout the city at various universities, talking about the Tunisian experience, how Egyptians could learn from the Tunisian experience, and there was very much this sentiment amongst the everyday person that I talked to that if the Tunisians can do this, we can do this as well. And what do we have? And secondly, what do we have to lose? So I think that, and even though you see things like food inflation in other places in the Middle East, I think we should remember that in Egypt it was worse than it was anywhere else. So you had the highest rates of food inflation of anywhere in the world in Egypt previous August, basically 18.5%. So 18.5% food inflation, that would jolt an economy like our own, let alone an economy where 30% of people are living under $2 a day.
Yeah.
So, please.
Hi, this is Lamia Youssef from MIT. So actually, I'd like first of all to thank you for all of the experience and all of the pictures that you have shared with us. I've been here from Cambridge following the news and especially the Facebook groups where they are. So it's actually very amazing for me to see it from the other side of where they have been blogging and where the actions actually were taking place. It's really amazing for me, so thank you. Actually, I have a comment and a question. So the first comment is actually just a technicality, which is my understanding is that Omar Suleiman is not in power anymore. So now the country is ruled by a council of the army, which is 12 to 13 members, as far as I understand. The second question is actually, my understanding also of the revolution is that it started with a group of Facebook members. Many of them are Americanly educated or Westernly educated, to be more specific. So I would like to question more about the role of Muslim Brotherhood in this revolution, especially that I understand that they have announced before the revolution that they are not joining, and they have asked their members not to join, which have made many of the Facebook members really quite upset with this announcement. And I believe 2 weeks ago they also have announced that they are not pushing any members or pushing any candidates for the upcoming presidential elections. The reason I'm asking that is that I was kind of surprised by your analogy between the Egyptian Revolution and the Iranian Revolution, because my understanding or what I've been monitoring is that it have very different reasons and very different causes.
Definitely.
Thank you.
I will defer to Iason on the issue of how active the Muslim Brotherhood has been throughout this process, but I will address two of those things. One is that I think I didn't mean to suggest that this is turning out like the Iranian Revolution. What I meant to suggest is that similarly to how the Iranian Revolution played out in terms of the difficulty that Western observers had with really understanding how things were going to turn out, or even the difficulty that in-country observers had in terms of seeing where things were going, there's an enormous veil of uncertainty there. That's all I meant to suggest in that regard. I do think the Muslim Brotherhood's really, really, really enormously restrained approach to political involvement during this process is, I think, actually a brilliant political maneuver. I think that they single-handedly, by doing that, are removing the biggest excuse that outside powers would have for stopping meaningful democratization in Egypt. They're basically completely undermining the negative narrative that this is just going to be a Muslim Brotherhood-dominated, one vote, one time sort of sham democracy that many of conservatives in the United States or in Europe would expect. That having been said, I think it's important to note that there is a parallel to the Iranian Revolution in that they have chosen as a spokesperson for their cause a Western liberal who has very, very minimal domestic standing in Egypt, Al-Baradei, right? In a recent poll, I think he came in at 2%, whereas Suleiman Mubarak, when he was still there, and Amr Moussa together took something like 70%. And so there's, I think, some reason to worry that he could play a role of a Bani Sadr in Iran, where I totally butchered that, sorry. Where in effect we had some really pleasant liberal window dressing on a revolution when in fact extremists were basically taking over all of the mechanisms of state and then were able to in effect hijack a popular revolution for their own motives. So I think it is important to ensure that whatever sort of political system results from this, I think the Egyptians would be wise, and I think outside countries involved in this process, to the extent that they are involved in political negotiations over it, I think they would be wise to consider the sort of system in which there is a large number of checks and balances on the power of any sort of political faction, be it the army or the Muslim Brotherhood or even other parties, to have some sort of winner-take-all system. Because I think that would be perhaps the quickest way to ensure that this sort of fantastic outflowing of popular sentiment could get derailed.
On the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood, just a very quick few points. Anecdotally, again, because it's hard to do academic research when you're... I spoke to one guy who said to me, Western liberal democracy doesn't suit us. All these liberal Western constructs, they don't fit our culture. We are debased, we're humiliated, we have so much wheat and so much production, but we have to take USAID handouts. So he didn't say, I want a caliphate, but he said that basically this parliamentary democratic system is not really his cup of tea. Another guy who was one of the organizers at the barricades, he was from Shubra, very respected. I think he might have been a sheikh. He led them in prayer, at least, when they took breaks from the defense. Also said, when I asked him about Sharia, he said, well, if you're going to be democratic and fair and equitable and just, then by de facto you will have Sharia, because Sharia is everything that is fair and equitable and just. And then I said, well, what about stoning? And he said, well, stoning is just one of these things that, it's in the Quran, but it doesn't really get, applied. And I said, well, what about Pakistan? It gets applied there. He said, well, that's Pakistan. So he bumped into Tahrir Square, who is former spokesman of the Brotherhood, when he was going to the Million Day Man March on Tuesday before the concession speech. And I asked him, what would you do with the Treaty for Israel? He said, we would maintain it. I said, what would you do with the Treaty for Israel if Israel invaded Gaza, as they did in 2008, and you're a democratically elected person, your people become livid at this imposition? Would you start doing mopping up operations and protecting the Egyptian border and interdicting tunnels like Mubarak was doing? At which point he turned his back on me, and it's a considerable back, if you know Tahrir Square. And then his followers attacked me orally. So that was an issue he didn't want to address. But again, a microscopically more democratic government would have to reflect people's negation of, criticism of Israel. And on the Muslim Brotherhood, saying they're not going to field a candidate for the presidency, that's completely material. We're moving away from a presidential system to a parliamentary prime ministerial one. They also say that they're not going to seek a parliamentary majority. That seems to challenge an understanding of the concept of democracy. You cannot control whether you get a majority or not. What will they do? Not field candidates in several areas to sabotage them their own selves? So these were all interesting things that were kind of juggling around in my head. One last thing, there was by far the most organized platform in Tahrir before it turned into a fairground was the Muslim Brotherhood ones. And I heard, but I didn't see with my own eyes, that there were Muslim Brotherhood people that had basically controlled it, who could enter and who could take the mic, even though it was supposed to be a very open kind of speaker's corner style place where anybody could pick up a mic and speak. At one of these platforms, and I'm not sure it was the Muslim Brotherhood one, at some point a woman who was a local resident took the mic and started criticizing the demonstrators and saying, you have paralyzed the center of the city, we live in fear for the last 3 weeks, stop it, for God's sake, just go, get out of here, you got your demands, just go now. At which point I heard a and the sound went dead, and then there was just, this sort of silence just washed in. And it was this funny moment when everyone just kind of looked at each other and they'd known what happened, but no one was going to say anything. And then one of the people on the platform started a chant of Ashab yurid isqat al-nizam, and everybody filled in shouting, the people want the overthrow of the regime, and everyone was happy again. That was scarily dictatorial. So these are the thoughts that I have in my head on what's going.
Yeah. Just one point on the Muslim Brotherhood in the early days, so on the Tuesday, the Wednesday, and the Thursday. So when I was out on Tuesday and Wednesday and speaking with people, we didn't encounter anyone, basically, from the Muslim Brotherhood who had said that they were there on the Muslim Brotherhood's behalf. And precisely that was in part because, as you said, on Facebook, they even came out and said, we're not going to partake in this. But if you remember what happened soon thereafter is that when things got a little bit out of control on Wednesday evening, Thursday evening, the then government came out and blamed the Muslim Brotherhood for actually causing the unrest. And so this was a really convenient pretext for the Muslim Brotherhood to then take all of their organizational capacity and say, well, if we're going to be blamed for this in the first place, why not just take to the streets, right? So I think that the timing there was pretty critical.
Also, the Muslim Brotherhood had been involved in labor unrest in Mahalla in 2008, right. And de facto, if you follow Rashid al-Ghannouchi, the Tunisian Islamist thinker, he very much represents this movement that the Muslim Brotherhood is also a part of, which is why they've been excommunicated by Al-Qaeda and other extremist organizations, because they renounce violence and they say, instead of becoming the shining city on the hill, we are so Islamic, we're so pure, you should come to us instead of us coming to you. We get to the nitty-gritty grassroots of the society and we start dealing with workers. We start representing workers and their rights. We stop creating a theocracy, but we start representing the dispossessed. So that's why I think they're also more popular in Egypt, but also more moderate, because there's this constant ihtikak, how do you say it, friction. Yeah.
Hi, so my name is Christoph Chung, and I'm a master's student in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning. The first question I have, well, both the questions that I have touch on the symbolic nature of the revolution. And Mr. Athanasiadis, I was wondering, it might be somewhat of a leading question or an esoteric question, but I was wondering if there were these sort of same types of turf battles in other parts of Cairo, or was it strictly within the square? And I'm wondering if that somehow can speak to the power, the symbolic power of public space, and if that has any sort of implications for these other revolutions that are happening in Pearl Square and Green Square. If somehow space can be, or the symbolic power or nature of space can be maybe one determining factor of whether or not a demonstration can be successful. So that's the urban planning hat, and I'll take that off and put on the foreign policy one. I think the other symbolic thing that resulted from this is that Iran had sent 2 warships through the Suez Canal very recently into the Mediterranean. And the question I have related to that is, what is Iran trying to say? What does it mean? And what should we be looking forward to in the next weeks or months?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. If a tree is felled in the middle of a dark forest, has it really been felled? If a fight happens in a public square and Al Jazeera doesn't have a live feed, has a revolution happened? Exactly. So Tahrir was the focal point. It was very important that the world's attention be there. Mubarak was suicidal for not cutting that link, since he's already demonstrably a dictator, he might as well act dictatorially, for God's sake. You know, so on the issue of Iran, they're merrily kind of in Latakia port right now, these two ships, and I heard that they paid $200,000 to pass through, but what does it mean?
So I think in the immediate, what does it mean this week? Personally, I think absolutely nothing. But I think in the future, it could have very significant military implications. So Gaza and Lebanon both border the sea. And in both of these places, there are organizations allied to Iran that significantly rely upon Iranian economic support, but also Iranian military aid. Now, with Hezbollah, they're usually resupplied through Syria, right? But that having been said, if Syria, for example, were to sign a peace agreement, which, you know, I'm not saying is probable, but one of the main hopes of a benefit of that sort of possible deal is that it would take Syria out of the arming Hezbollah game. If Iran has naval access to Lebanon directly, it doesn't matter so much. Now, there could even be military combat with Israeli naval forces. So that's a possibility for instability when you put those two forces against each other that normally are separated. But that having been said, we don't know whether the Egyptian government is going to be letting these ships through Suez much longer. The military folks actually see Iran as a significant threat. Now, the question is, what is their political environment domestically in Egypt going to look like for them in terms of how they approach this? And also, how much power are they really going to control over the Suez? But if they see a significant military component to it, my guess is the Egyptian military would be reluctant to continue letting Iran pass through Suez.
I have a question for David, if possible.
Okay, so one last question from Iason to David. I think we're well over time.
I heard that the State Department was basically out of the equation as of the nights of the phone call of Obama to Mubarak and then the concession speech. And the Pentagon took over. They activated a whole series of mid-level contacts and high-level ones they had. And they told the Egyptian army that basically we have your back if you decide to let Mubarak know that he's history. Could you tell us a little bit more about these, sort of the insider track, what was going on?
I wish I could. I was even in D.C. last week meeting with a lot of Middle East policy folks, and it's really difficult, I found at least, to get information on this sort of thing. I think it's certainly plausible. Now, that having been said, as you see, the main point person in Egypt, in Tunisia now, is Bill Burns, the number 3 diplomat at the State Department. So I don't think state is necessarily out for the count, but when it came to the internal situation in Egypt and the military versus Mubarak, it's certainly plausible, but I certainly don't have the evidence for it.
One final question?
Oh, great. Thank you. I'll be quick. My name's Eric. I'm from MIT. I just have a question about gender division. I wasn't surprised to hear that there were women on the front lines throwing rocks and that sort of thing and standing tall, but I was encouraged to hear that they're being treated as equals and that there's a movement maybe starting with that. And I wondered if you saw that while you were there and if anything might be coming.
No, I mean, they weren't at the front lines and they weren't throwing stones. It was mostly the men. There are a few women who were in the in those lines that you saw, those kind of lines of solidarity, but they got, taken back for their own safety. In that you can intuit an element of gender imbalance, if you'd like, and absolutely no comparison between the women of Iran in 2009 or last week and the women of Egypt. The women of Iran were actually tactically a part of the game. They were funneled forward by the demonstrators, at least in the first few days, because they assumed that the soldiers would not open fire on women. In fact, they did, and so several of them got hit with rubber bullets and so on. But they were very, very much a part. They were even more brave than the men in some cases. Right. Not in Cairo. They were breaking more the stones inside the square. They were doing resupply logistics. They were sounding the bell of alarm when there would be an attack on a certain, but they weren't involved in the fighting.
Okay. And you don't think the division is breaking down at all? through what was happening?
I mean, they were there for once it became a field day, though, right? I mean, it was a gender mixed crowd.
Yeah, they flooded in when it became.
Right.
But
in terms of
there were people
siege.
there in that second week. There were women there, and particularly the more religious ones. Like I didn't see a single, except for the ones up in Pierre's apartment, who were your kind of AUC, American University of Cairo graduate, internationalist crowd. The ones who were down on the square doing the hard work of breaking stones and so on were pious, religious conservatives, monolinguals.
Yeah, I mean, what I saw in the first couple of days on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday were basically women chanting slogans, but definitely nowhere near the front lines where things were getting violent, basically. So they would chant slogans in front of the journalist syndicate or in front of the lawyers syndicate, but they weren't the people who were instigating any of the of the clashes, the violent clashes. And then as the days went on, as Saturday and Sunday sort of progressed, women were disappearing from the streets. I mean, I was told on numerous occasions, well, what are you doing out? I mean, I can't even believe you're here. And granted, I do have electrically blonde hair, but...
Laura Logan.
Yeah. So, anyways, well, thanks very much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you for Iason and David's comments.